Hey guys, it's John from Write Creative with another episode of How to Code It. And I'm super excited about today's episode. I've seen this effect that I'm going to be showing you a couple of times now. And the last time I saw it, I was like, man, that would be a really cool idea for a video. So I spent the last couple of days trying to reverse engineer this and figure out how to do it in a simple way. And I think I've got it. So today I'm recording this to kind of share some of those findings with you and show you how to go about recreating it. So the effect that I'm talking about, of course, is, I don't know if there's an official name for it. I've been calling it bilateral scrolling. But what effectively happens is, as I'm scrolling down this page, I'm just scrolling down normally. And as you get to this section here, even though I'm continuing to scroll vertically, the content is scrolling horizontally. And you can see the scroll bar is moving down the page still. And then as you get to the end of this section, after it's done scrolling horizontally, vertical scrolling resumes as normal. And then if you scroll back up, the animation reverses and just plays in reverse. So it's a super cool effect. I think there's a lot of creative uses that you could do with it. And so that's what we're going to be recreating today. So yeah, let's just dive right into it. So once again, I'm in Codepen here, and off screen I went ahead and just did a little bit of preliminary work to prevent this video from getting too long. There's nothing super complex going on here, and certainly nothing that really pertains to what we're trying to create. Really, all I did was just add some basic styles to the environment, along with these two divs that are really nothing more than just two very tall divs that force us to have to scroll. The effect that we're building tends to work best when you have to scroll down a bit to get to it. So really that's all these bumper divs are, just something to give us some room to scroll. If you really want to see the CSS that I use for these sections, there's a link to this Codepen in the notes, but I mainly wanted to just keep the focus of this video on the actual effect that we're trying to create, so hopefully that doesn't throw you off too much. Now, in my last video, I was able to split the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript sections up pretty cleanly, but for today's episode, in order for me to explain this well, I'm going to be jumping between the different sections quite a bit here, so please just kind of bear with me as I go. I think it'll make a lot more sense to you if I kind of jump around a bit. So with all of that being said, to recreate this effect, we're going to be relying on two main CSS properties, and the first of which is kind of the biggie. This is what's going to make the magic happen, and it's this little known CSS property called sticky. And the sticky property is super cool. There's a lot of really neat things that you can do with it. And if you're not familiar with this property, basically all it does is it causes an element to stick to the top of the browser window until you scroll past its parent element. So I have a little example mocked up here. As you can see, I have this little, well, not so little, but this red box kind of floating in the middle here. And as I scroll down, it edges closer to the top of the screen, and then once you get to the top, it becomes stuck, and it kind of stays stuck to the top of the screen until you scroll past its parent element. So its parent element is the pink box, and you'll see that as soon as you're past that, it's no longer stuck to the top of the screen. So that's the sticky element, and that's going to be what really makes this effect come to life. That, along with a transform property. So that's the gist of it. Let's go ahead and start writing some HTML to make this happen. Okay, so I've started this a couple of different times now, trying to figure out the best way to present it so that it makes the most sense. And while I was originally going to kind of bounce back and forth between the HTML and CSS, I think it might be better to just write out all of the HTML, and then as I'm writing the CSS, the structure of this HTML is just going to make a little bit more sense. So that's what we're going to do, and I'm going to start by making a section that's essentially going to be a wrapper for the entire horizontal scrolling region. So I'll type here, section, and I'm going to give it a class name of just horizontal section. And again, this is basically just going to be a wrapper for everything else that we're going to be doing here. And then inside of this, we are going to create what's going to be our sticky element that I had previously mentioned. Now, again, this will make more sense as we start writing the CSS and JavaScript for it, but for now, we're just going to make a div, and we're going to call it sticky wrapper. Oops. And then inside of here, we're going to need another element that serves as a wrapper for all of the content that we're going to be scrolling. And this is going to be what makes all of the content that we're scrolling kind of fall into a horizontal line, all side by side. So we're going to say div class equals horizontal. Let's call it element wrapper. And then inside of this, we're going to be putting all of the elements that we want to scroll. So in this case, I'm just going to put a bunch of divs in here, and then we'll style them to look like colored boxes. But this could be it could be images, it could be videos, it could be header tags. Really any block level element would work just fine here. So in our case, I'm just going to do div class equals element. And then I'm going to put 5 of them in there, just so we have enough content to scroll. And again, these don't have to be divs, and you don't have to use 5. You can do as many as you want or as few as you want. But in our case, this is just going to be what we put in to make the demo work. So this makes up pretty much the entirety of the HTML that we'll need for this demonstration. So now we can move on to the CSS, which will hopefully give you a bit better understanding of why we needed this HTML markup and what's essentially going on here. Okay, with our HTML written, let's focus our attention on the CSS for a bit. Now, as I'm writing the CSS, I'm actually going to do this from the inside out, as I think that will help you understand each piece just a little bit better. So we'll start, of course, with our innermost HTML, which are these elements here. So what we're going to do is we're going to say .element, and we will just add some basic styles to this so that we can kind of visualize what they look like. So we will just maybe add some width, say 500 pixels. We'll give it a height of 400 pixels. We'll give it a background color, just say purple. We will give it a margin, a right margin, so whenever we pull these up onto the same line, they're not all smashed against each other. And that should be good for right now. So you can see here are all of our elements. And then next, we're going to put some styling on our element wrapper. So for this, we want all of these elements to sit side by side. Now, we could technically use floats to do that, but in our case, there's an easier and more modern way to go about it, which is flexbox. So on this element, we're going to say .element wrapper, and we're going to say position relative display flex. And notice, as soon as I did that, it pulled all of these elements onto the same line. Now, that's what we want, but what we don't want is for these elements to shrink to fit the size of the browser window. So by default, what's happening is our div element is going to try and stay inside of the browser window, or the parent element in this case. So in order to do that, it's actually shrinking each of these divs down, which we don't want to happen. And so the way we fix that is by adding the flex shrink property to the elements, and we're going to set it to 0. So on our element, we're going to say flex shrink 0. Now, this is a binary value, which means it can only be a 0 or a 1. 0 means false, 1 means true. And in this case, what we're doing is what we're saying is we don't want these elements to shrink in a flex box, so we set that property to false. And when we do that, you can see that now these kind of blow out of the browser window, which in one way is what we want, but of course we don't necessarily want our browser to be doing the scrolling. We want the element itself to do the scrolling. And so we're going to handle some of that with JavaScript, But for right now, we're going to add in another style on this sticky wrapper. So we're going to say sticky wrapper, and we want that to be 100% of the screen, and we want to say overflow hidden. And you'll see now we can't scroll horizontally anymore. And since this is our sticky wrapper, we're also going to say position sticky. And again, this will make a little bit more sense when we get to the JavaScript portion, but this is going to be what helps us to kind of stick in the browser window and prevent, like as we scroll, it's going to prevent the page from moving down, or at least that's the illusion. Now, anytime we use position sticky, you also need to add in the top property in order for it to work properly. And in our case, I'm going to set that to 100 pixels because we want it to not necessarily stick to the very top of the screen. We might want to give it a little bit of a padding there so that it just looks a little bit better. And you can tinker with this value in your own project. So as you're implementing this into whatever site you're building, you may want to just tinker with that value a bit and use what looks best for whatever you're building. And so finally, I'm just going to add a couple of extra styles here onto our horizontal section. So right now, these elements are sticking right to the very top of it. So I'm going to give it some padding at the top and bottom. And that gives it a little bit of space there. And then just to make it a little bit easier to see, we're going to say background color pink. Okay, so this pretty much wraps up all of the CSS that we're going to need in order to make this work. And really, it doesn't look like much now. It doesn't behave the way we want it to. We're really going to need JavaScript to kind of finally bring this effect home. And so that is what we're going to do next. All right, the final piece of this is of course going to be the JavaScript. And unfortunately, just to give you some forewarning, this is also going to be the most complex part of this video. Now, the good news is we don't need a lot of JavaScript in order to make this work, but the bit we do need can be a bit tricky to understand. So bear with me, I'm going to do my very best to explain what's going on, but please, if you have any questions or if anything doesn't make sense to you, please feel free to just leave a comment or send me a message and I'll be happy to explain things a bit better. But with that said, essentially we're going to start by taking some measurements of the screen and the elements of the screen, then determining how much we have to scroll horizontally. We also need to determine if the horizontal section is in view, and then we need to programmatically adjust the X coordinate of our element wrapper based on how much we've scrolled. Now, I know that was a mouthful. It probably sounded a bit confusing. Again, bear with me, and hopefully it'll just make more sense as we get a little bit further in, as you see each of these little elements being built. So for starters, we're just going to capture a couple of dimensions. And so first up, we need the width of the screen. And so to do that, we type var window width equals window.inner width. And what that will do is that will get the width of our browser window. And it stores it into a variable called window width. And just so you can see, if I type console.log window width, you'll see it pops a number down here that's 1712, which means our window, in my case, is 1712 pixels wide. Okay. Next, we need to capture the width of the element that we're scrolling. So in our case, we have this element wrapper that is stretched around all of the elements that we want to scroll. So we're going to use the scroll width property of JavaScript and write the following. So we're going to say var horizontal length equals document.querySelector element wrapper scroll width. And so once again, I'm going to do a console.log for horizontal length. And we'll see that the horizontal length that we need to scroll is 2,580 pixels. So each of these 5 elements that I have here, along with their margins, is going to be 2,580 pixels long. Okay. Now, next, we need to calculate the distance from the top of the page down to the horizontal section. And the reason we need this measurement is we ultimately don't want it to start scrolling until the element is in view. So if this top bumper section here was like some huge number, like 40,000 pixels tall, and we started to horizontally scroll this sideways as soon as the user started to scroll, by the time the user would scroll down to that section or get past that huge long bumper, the horizontal scrolling would already be finished. So we actually want to wait until the user scrolls, and so this section is in view before we start to scroll these elements horizontally. So to get the distance from the top of the screen to this pink section here, we're going to type var dist from top equals document.query selector dot horizontal section dot offset top. And once again, I'm going to do a console.log dist from top. And we will see that this pink section is 900 pixels from the top of the screen. And we can verify this, or we can confirm this, because if you look at the CSS I have for this bumper, you'll see that I have a height of 900 pixels. So we know that this section is 900 pixels from the top of the page. Now, finally, we're going to need a variable to figure out how far we need to scroll our horizontal section horizontally. So to explain this, I have a little mock-up of this effect set up in Adobe XD. And so as you can see, we have this row of elements here, which is set to 0 pixels on the x-axis. You can see that up here, which means it's right up against the edge of the page. And if you measure how far you can scroll horizontally until we get to the end, so if I start scrolling this horizontally until we get to the end, which is right here, you'll see that that x-axis becomes negative 1080, which means we have to scroll this 1080 pixels in order to go from the beginning here to the end here. Okay? Now, that's fine, but watch what happens if we shrink our browser window down. So we're going to say this artboard is our browser, and right now it's 1500 pixels wide. But if this is 700 pixels wide, watch what happens. Right now, again, we start at 0, but in order for us to get to the end of this, we are now at negative 1880. Okay? So the width of the browser window, the length of the element wrapper, and then the distance that we have to scroll from the top of the page to this section, they're all going to affect how much we have to scroll. So we need to calculate that value. And I know that all sounds really complex, but the math is actually really simple, and it looks like this. So we're going to say var scroll distance equals dist from top plus horizontal length minus window width. So these last 3 things that we've calculated are just a simple calculation, and this is going to tell us how much we have to scroll to get to the end of our scrolling section. So if I do a console.log scroll distance, you'll see that we have to scroll 1768 pixels to get to the end of this here. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is we need to, basically this whole effect is not going to work unless we do this piece. So we need to dynamically set the height of this pink section. And this is how our sticky element knows when to stop being sticky, basically. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say document.query selector horizontal section style height equals horizontal length plus px. Okay, I want to pause here for just a moment and explain what's happening here for those of you who might not be super comfortable with JavaScript. And so the first piece of this simply finds our horizontal section. So we're saying in the document, find an element that has a class called horizontal section. And then we target the styles of the horizontal section. And very specifically, we want to target the height of horizontal section. Now, the equal sign basically says everything that comes after this is going to be the height of our horizontal section. So in our case, horizontal length is going to translate to whatever we calculated it to up here. And then we're going to append pixels after that. Okay, so horizontal length is kind of the total width of our wrapper, and then the plus px, it's actually called string concatenation. And essentially we're just adding the units to the width, in this case pixels. So by the time all of this is said and done, we're setting the height of our horizontal section to, I believe, 1768 pixels. Okay. Now, if that still doesn't make sense to you, again, please feel free to send me a message or leave a comment. I'll be happy to try and articulate that further. But with this done, we're on to the final portion of this. And that is basically to do something every time we scroll. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually be adjusting the x coordinate of our element wrapper whenever we scroll. So we're going to start this by saying window.onScroll equals function. And again, if you're not super familiar with JavaScript, basically whatever code we put inside these curly braces is going to get run whenever the user scrolls. Now, this is a highly sensitive function, and so you want to be a bit careful here. Scrolling just a little bit is going to cause this function to run dozens of times, which can be a drag on performance. Now, fortunately, we're only going to be running a few very short commands, but in general, you want to be careful with this onScroll event. And so inside here, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to detect how much we've scrolled down the page. And to do that, we do the following. We're going to say var scroll top equals window.pagey offset. And I'm going to do a console.log on scroll top here. And I want you to watch what happens. So basically we're saying every time we scroll up or down, it doesn't matter, as we're scrolling, we're going to run this code inside here. So we're calculating how far we've scrolled. That's what window.pagey offset does. It tells you how far you've scrolled or how far you've traveled past the top of the document or the page, and then we're just spitting it out. So watch what happens. As I start to scroll, you start to see all these numbers down here in the console. And this is telling you how many pixels we have scrolled past the top. So as I scroll down, that number keeps growing incrementally higher. The faster I scroll, the faster it runs. And when I'm at the very top, you'll see it goes right back to 0. So even if I scroll a little bit, this runs a bunch of times. So you can see where this could be a drag on performance if you're trying to load and reload images or something like that. So just be a little bit careful with this. But essentially, we're just figuring out how far we've scrolled from the top. Okay. The next thing that we need to do is we're going to check to see if the amount that we've scrolled is greater than or equal to the distance to our horizontal section here. And if it is greater or equal to, then we know that this is in view, fully in view. And then we need to handle when to stop it so that this isn't just continually scrolling forever. We need to know, okay, we've gotten past this, so let's not do this anymore. So we need to add a second check inside of our function that says if scroll top, that's how far we've scrolled, is greater than or equal to dist from top. So in other words, as long as we have scrolled more than this distance to this section, and we are less than, or we've scrolled less than this previously calculated scroll distance. If both of those conditions are true, then we're going to run whatever is inside these curly braces. Okay? So finally, what we put in here is going to be the final statement and the single statement that makes everything happen. And what we're going to be doing in here is we're going to be adjusting the X position of this element wrapper. And so we do that with the following. Now, forewarning, this is a bit of a mouthful. I'll explain this all a bit more. But we're going to say document.querySelector.elementWrapper.style.transform equals translate X minus scroll top minus dist from top plus px, whoops, and then close it. Okay, once I pop this in, you can see that everything is working the way that we expect it to. Once we get to the top, this horizontal section starts scrolling horizontally until it gets to the end, and then we finish it up. Okay, now I want to go back to this last statement for just a few minutes and kind of explain everything that's happening here as best as I can. So once again, as with before, this document.querySelector.elementWrapper, it basically says where in the document does an element with the class of elementWrapper exist. Then we're going into the style property of that, and very specifically, we're looking at the transform property. Okay? And then everything after the equal sign is what we're going to set the transform property to. So in this case, this whole thing boils down to a string that looks something like this. It'll say translate X negative some number pixels. Okay? This whole thing is going to basically boil down to this. So you can see the translate X is a negative value because we want it scrolling to a negative X position. This is just a calculation, calculating the distance from how far we've scrolled to the distance of the top. And then we just append the letter PX at the end to say that this is pixels. Okay? Now, and this number, of course, will change as we scroll because it's happening within the onScroll event. So again, I'm fully aware that this is a complex calculation and it might not immediately make sense why it all works and how I arrived at these numbers. It definitely took me a lot of tinkering around and messing with different values to get it to this point. But what most web developers probably don't want to tell you is sometimes it's okay if we don't know exactly how or why something works. Sometimes just having a basic grasp on something is good enough. But with that being said, I encourage you to take this example and adjust each piece of this and just see how it affects the overall effect and try and give yourself a better understanding of exactly what's happening here. And of course, if you have questions, I'm happy to supplement that as best as I can. But with this last little piece in place, it basically completes our project and brings us to the end of this video. So as always, if you have questions about this project or if you have ideas for other things that you would like to see, please leave a comment below. If you liked this video or got some value from this video, give it a thumbs up and share it. And other than that, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.